Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool air of autumn swept through the small town, Sarah would settle into her favorite spot on the porch. The rocking chair creaked with each gentle push, the rhythmic motion soothing her after a long day at work. She loved the quiet that surrounded her home, nestled at the edge of the woods. The only sounds were the whispers of wind through the trees and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful, and it was her escape from the noise of the world. But tonight, something was different. First, Sarah thought it was just her imagination. She glanced up from the cup of tea she had been sipping and saw a dark figure moving at the edge of her porch, just outside the reach of the porch light. She squinted, unsure of what she was seeing. The figure shifted again, and this time, she could make out the outline of a large animal. Its massive form hunched low to the ground. A bear. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't uncommon for bears to roam the area, but they usually stayed deep in the woods. This one, however, was far too close. Its shaggy brown coat gleamed under the moonlight as it moved with a fluidity that seemed almost deliberate. It wasn't scurrying away at the sight of her. No, it was simply watching her, unmoving, as if it had all the time in the world. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to retreat inside, to lock the door and wait for the bear to wander off. But the animal didn't seem aggressive. It didn't even seem afraid. It stood there, staring at her with dark, intelligent eyes that made her stomach tighten. It was unnerving. She slowly set her tea down on the table beside her, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bear didn't flinch. It remained rooted to the spot, its gaze never leaving hers. "Hey there," Sarah murmured under her breath, half to herself. It was a ridiculous thing to say, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. The bear didn't respond, of course, but its posture, calm, yet watchful, spoke volumes. It seemed to be sizing her up, its large body rippling with muscle beneath the thick fur. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Sarah remained seated in her chair, her heart thudding against her ribcage as she tried to make sense of the situation. Was it hungry? Was it just curious? And why was it here, right on her porch? She had heard of bears becoming bolder in the fall, desperate for food, but this felt different. This felt intentional. The animal took a slow step forward, and Sarah instinctively stood, her hand hovering near the door handle, ready to retreat into the safety of her home. But the bear did not charge. Instead, it moved a few more steps closer, the soft padding of its paws on the earth the only sound breaking the silence. Sarah's breath hitched, and a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't normal. "Go on, bear. Go back into the woods," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to the creature. The bear, to her surprise, stopped a few feet from the porch, still watching her. Then, without warning, it turned its head slightly and began to walk toward the edge of the yard. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. Was it leaving? Was that all it wanted? She took a step forward, ready to breathe a sigh of relief, when the bear paused and glanced back at her. It was almost as if it were waiting for her, as if it wanted her to follow. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea why, but something in that moment, something in the bear's behavior, compelled her to follow. She wasn't sure if it was the strange, magnetic pull of the animal's presence or the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but her feet moved almost instinctively. Before she could stop herself, Sarah found herself stepping off the porch, her bare feet crunching against the cool grass as she walked toward the woods. The bear, steady and silent, led the way, its massive form cutting through the underbrush with ease. She hesitated, glancing back at her house, but something about the stillness of the night kept her moving forward. It was like a dream or perhaps a nightmare, but it felt like it was meant to be. The woods enveloped her quickly, the thick trees and tall grass making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The bear moved effortlessly through the dense vegetation, its large paws barely making a sound. Sarah tried to keep up, but her pace was slower, careful, her senses alert. Every snap of a twig beneath her feet, every rustle in the brush seemed amplified in the silence. As they continued deeper into the forest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the air around her had changed. It wasn't just the temperature dropping, or the stillness that seemed to blanket the woods. No, it was something else. There was a presence in the air, thick with something ancient, something primal. The bear stopped at the edge of a clearing, and Sarah almost walked right into it, her eyes still scanning the trees for any sign of movement. When she looked up, she froze. In front of her was a large, ancient oak tree. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, its roots protruding from the ground like massive fingers, as though it were reaching out to her. The tree looked alive, but not in the way a tree should be. There was something unnatural about it, something that made her breath catch in her throat. And then, in the dim light, Sarah saw it. At the base of the oak, nestled in the roots, was something. A figure, lying still and silent in the earth. She could just make out the shape of a small body, covered in leaves and moss, barely noticeable in the shadows. It was a child, no older than 5 or 6, lying motionless, face hidden by the overgrowth. Her heart stopped. Is that a child?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The bear, now standing at her side, lowered its massive head as if acknowledging the question, but it did not speak. It simply stood there, as though it had led her here for a reason. Sarah's legs felt weak beneath her as she knelt beside the child, her hands trembling as she gently brushed away the moss and leaves that covered its face. The child's skin was pale, its features soft and innocent, but there was something unsettling about the stillness, the unnatural calmness of the figure. Sarah's fingers brushed against the child's cheek, but there was no warmth. The child was cold, lifeless. She looked up at the bear, her breath ragged, her mind struggling to make sense of the sight before her. Why had the bear led her here? Why had it shown her this child? And then, just as Sarah was about to rise, something shifted in the air. The ground beneath her feet trembled lightly, as though the earth itself was alive. The tree before her groaned, its massive trunk creaking as if it were stretching, awakening from a long slumber. The leaves around them rustled in a sudden gust of wind, and the air became thick with a strange energy. The bear stepped back, growling low, its eyes wide with caution. Before Sarah could react, the child's hand twitched. The small fingers curled slightly, and then, with a sudden jolt, the child's eyes snapped open. They were not human eyes. They were something else, dark, almost black, and they glowed faintly in the dim light of the forest. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The child's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she felt as though it was looking into her very soul. The bear growled louder now, a warning sound, but the child didn't move. Instead, the air grew even heavier, the energy becoming almost suffocating, as though the very essence of the forest was watching, waiting for something to unfold. And then the voice came. It wasn't the voice of a child, but something ancient and deep, resonating through the ground, through the air. "Why are you here?" the voice whispered, low and chilling. Sarah could barely form a thought. The question hung in the air, and for the first time in her life, she realized she wasn't alone in this forest. She was never meant to be alone. The bear stood protectively beside her, its eyes never leaving the child's. Something was awakening here, something that had been waiting, biding its time. And it was clear now that Sarah had been brought here for a reason, to witness something that, once revealed, could never be unseen. The answer to that question, to the mystery of the child, to the forest itself, was something Sarah was only beginning to understand. And whether she was ready or not, she was about to find out exactly why the forest had called her here. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away from the child, her eyes still fixed on the strange, glowing orbs that now stared at her. The forest around her seemed to hum with energy, the air thickening, pressing in from all sides. She could feel the weight of the ancient presence, like the very ground beneath her was alive, watching her every move. The child's hand twitched again, and Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to react to the surreal scene unfolding before her. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, held captive by something she couldn't understand. The bear, too, stood at her side, growling low, its body tense with a primal instinct Sarah had never witnessed before. The animal was no longer the calm, watchful creature from earlier. Now, it was a protector, a force of nature that seemed to understand the dangers lurking in the shadows of the forest. It was as if the bear was saying, "Stay back, human." Yet, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the child, or whatever it had become. The child's mouth moved, but no sound came at first. Then, the same deep, resonant voice from earlier echoed through the clearing again, filling the space with a heavy, almost suffocating presence. "Why are you here?" the voice asked once more, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a demand. Sarah's pulse raced. She had no answers, no explanation for why she was here. She had only come out of curiosity, following the bear without thought, trusting that it would lead her somewhere. But now, standing in the face of this unknown, something deep within her stirred. She knew she couldn't leave, not without understanding the truth. But the truth, she feared, might break her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just walking. I didn't mean to." "You are not meant to be here," the voice interrupted, cutting through her words like a sharp knife. "This place is not for the living to walk freely. But you..." The child's eyes flashed, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze around them. The trees shuddered, as if they, too, felt the intensity of the moment. The bear let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing, but it didn't move forward. Instead, it seemed to wait, as if it understood that something much greater than it was at play here. Sarah's heart raced. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, awaiting the answer. The child's mouth opened again, but this time, the voice that came out was different, softer, more sorrowful. "You must understand. You are the key. The balance has been disturbed, and you, like the one before you, will be the one to restore it." Sarah blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of the words. "Restore balance?" she repeated, her voice shaky. "What balance? What do you mean?" The child's eyes glowed brighter, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "The forest, the land you call home, it has been poisoned. A curse, old as time itself, has seeped into the heart of this place. It feeds on the land, and it feeds on those who enter. You..." The child's gaze locked onto Sarah, piercing her, as if looking deep into her soul. "You have been chosen, not by chance but by fate." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating in Sarah's chest. "Chosen for what?" she demanded, her voice rising despite herself. Her hands shook, and she clenched them into fists, trying to hold on to something, anything, amidst the confusion. "What does it mean that I'm chosen?" The child tilted its head, and its lips curled into an unsettling smile, one that was both too wide and too empty. "It means that you must choose. You must decide. Whether to leave, to flee, or to stay and face the true darkness that lies within the heart of this forest." Caleb's mind reeled as the creature spoke, the weight of its words pressing down on him. The forest had been poisoned, a curse had taken root. He had no idea what was happening or how it all connected, but he knew one thing for sure. The forest wasn't simply a place of trees and wildlife. It was alive in a way he hadn't understood before, and now it had claimed him. The child's form seemed to flicker, as though the very essence of it was tied to something beyond the physical realm. The air around Sarah grew heavier, thick with the strange energy that had once drawn her into the woods. She reached for the pendant around her neck, a small silver medallion her grandmother had given her years ago. It had always brought her comfort, but tonight, it felt like a lifeline, something to ground her. "You want me to stay?" Sarah asked, her voice faltering as she spoke, half afraid of the answer. The very idea of it terrified her, but at the same time, she felt a deep pull toward the forest, toward the child, and toward the bear, who still stood loyally at her side. The child smiled again, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. "You cannot leave now. The forest will not allow it. The curse has taken root too deeply. It must be undone. And you are the one who will do it." Sarah looked at the bear, her heart in her throat. The animal's gaze was unwavering, its presence a silent confirmation of the child's words. It had led her here for a reason, and the weight of that reason was beginning to dawn on her. "But I don't know how," she said quietly, her voice filled with desperation. "I don't know what to do." For a long moment, there was only silence. The bear watched her, its eyes full of an understanding that she couldn't quite grasp. And then, just as Sarah was about to give in to the overwhelming confusion, the child spoke again, its voice softer this time, almost gentle. "You must follow. Follow the bear and it will show you the way. There is a place in the heart of the forest where the land is pure. It has been hidden from the world for centuries. But now you must find it. You must bring the light back, or all will be lost." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. The weight of the words pressed against her, but a part of her knew that she had no other choice. There was something in her, something deep within her soul, that knew the only way forward was to trust the bear, to trust the forest, and to trust herself. She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she looked at the child. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'll find the place. I'll fix what's been broken." The child's smile deepened, a shadow of approval passing over its face. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it dissolved into the shadows, its form evaporating like mist in the morning sun. The forest, too, seemed to exhale, as if releasing a breath it had been holding for too long. The bear moved again, turning and walking deeper into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the trees. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then, with one last look at the place where the child had stood, she followed. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, the ground beneath her feet soft and yielding, as though the forest itself was guiding her. The journey was far from over, but now, for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a wanderer lost in the woods. She was a part of something greater, a force of nature that could heal or destroy, depending on the choices she made. The forest stretched out before her, an ancient labyrinth of trees, shadows, and forgotten places. And with each step she took, Sarah knew that she was not alone. The bear was with her, the forest was with her, and the curse that had plagued this land would soon meet its reckoning. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the forest as she trailed the bear, its large form moving effortlessly through the dense underbrush. The trees seemed to part just enough to allow her to follow, the path unfolding in front of her like a secret map the woods had kept hidden for centuries. She barely thought of her steps anymore. It was as though the forest itself was guiding her, urging her to continue, even as fear and uncertainty tugged at her heart. The air around her was cool, but the deeper she walked into the woods, the more alive it felt. Every rustle of the leaves, every subtle shift of the earth beneath her feet, seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, like the heartbeat of the land itself. The darkness of the night had thickened, wrapping itself around the trees like a cloak, but the bear's presence in front of her brought an odd comfort, a steady force that reminded her she wasn't alone in this journey. Still, the weight of the task ahead weighed heavily on Sarah. The child's words lingered in her mind. "You are the key. You are the one who will restore the balance." How was she supposed to do that? What could a woman like her, someone who had never been part of anything mystical, anything supernatural, do in the face of something so vast, so ancient? She thought of her grandmother, the one who had passed down the silver medallion she wore around her neck. Sarah had always seen it as a token of love, a reminder of home. But now, in the depths of the forest, it felt like more than just a family heirloom. It felt like a key, an anchor to her identity in a world she hadn't even begun to understand. Was it possible that her connection to this forest, to the curse that plagued it, had always been there, waiting to be awakened? The bear slowed, stopping at the edge of another clearing, and Sarah came to a halt behind it. The creature stood still, its eyes scanning the surroundings, and Sarah felt a ripple of tension pass through the air. She couldn't see what lay beyond the trees, but the atmosphere had changed. The very ground seemed to hum with an eerie energy, and the silence was so profound that it almost felt unnatural. Even the wind had stilled. "Is this it?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was asking. The bear didn't respond, but Sarah felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward the center of the clearing. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment, the gravity of her decision, in every movement. As she entered the clearing, she looked around and gasped. At the heart of the space stood an ancient stone circle, overgrown with vines and moss, the edges of the stones worn smooth by time. In the center, an altar of sorts was carved from the stone itself, covered with intricate patterns and symbols that seemed to shift and change as Sarah's eyes traced them. It was as if the very rocks held the memories of the forest, ancient knowledge embedded in every crack and crevice. The bear stepped forward, its massive form casting a long shadow across the clearing. It made its way toward the altar, and Sarah, her breath caught in her throat, followed. The moment she crossed the threshold into the circle, the ground beneath her seemed to hum with a deep, resonating vibration, and she stopped, the energy pulsing through her chest. The orb in her hand began to glow again, this time brighter than before, its light reflecting off the stones, filling the space with a soft, ethereal radiance. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, as though speaking louder would shatter the fragile silence. The bear, standing by the altar, turned its head toward her, its dark eyes glowing with an understanding that transcended words. It pawed at the stone gently, a sound like distant thunder echoing in the stillness. Sarah took a step forward, feeling the pull of the orb growing stronger with each passing moment. She hesitated, then stepped toward the altar, feeling as though something ancient was urging her onward. With trembling hands, she placed the orb on the stone surface. The moment it touched the cold rock, a rush of energy shot through her, so powerful that it nearly knocked her off her feet. She gasped, her body trembling as the light from the orb flickered and surged, wrapping around her like a cocoon. The stones beneath her feet began to vibrate with a low hum, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The forest had been waiting for her. She could feel it now, the weight of the forest's ancient power coursing through her veins, pulling her closer to the earth, closer to the heart of the forest. Sarah closed her eyes as the light from the orb became blinding, and she saw visions, glimpses of the past, flashes of things she could not understand, of a time long before her. The forest had once been vibrant, full of life, but something had come, something dark, and it had tainted the land. The balance had been broken, and the curse had taken root. The images came faster now, swirling around her like a storm, each one more vivid than the last. She saw figures, beings of light and shadow, fighting, struggling to protect the land from a malevolent force. But in the end, the darkness had consumed them, leaving only fragments of their power, their essence, scattered throughout the forest. The curse had taken hold, and the forest had begun to wither. And then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The shadow had a face, a twisted, monstrous face, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It was the source of the curse, the thing that had destroyed the balance. But there was something more, something in the darkness that Sarah recognized. She saw herself, standing before the shadow, a younger version of herself, her face filled with fear and confusion. She didn't understand, not fully, but the vision was clear. She was meant to face this thing. She was the one who would restore the balance or destroy the forest trying. With a gasp, Sarah opened her eyes, and the light from the orb dimmed. She blinked rapidly, her body shaking as the force of the vision faded. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and for a moment, she thought she might fall. But the bear was there, standing beside her, its large form grounding her, offering its silent support. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. The weight of what she had just witnessed pressed down on her like an unbearable force. The curse, the shadow, the darkness. It was all connected to her, to the forest. But what could she do? What was she supposed to do now that she understood the enormity of her role in this story? Her heart pounded in her chest, and she turned toward the bear, searching its gaze for answers. The creature stood still, its eyes never leaving hers, as if waiting for her to find the strength within herself to make the next move. "The curse," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "I have to stop it. But how?" The bear growled softly, as if acknowledging her determination. Its gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt as though the forest itself had wrapped her in its embrace, offering her the strength she needed to face whatever lay ahead. She knew what she had to do now. She had to find the source of the curse and confront it, no matter the cost. But she wasn't alone. The bear was with her, and she knew that somehow, the forest had chosen her for this task because she was meant to face this challenge. Not just for herself, but for the world she had come to love. Taking a deep breath, Sarah nodded to the bear, feeling a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her or what dangers awaited, but she knew one thing: she would not back down. With one last glance at the altar, she turned, the bear at her side, and stepped deeper into the forest. The darkness that once seemed so threatening now felt like something she could confront. The forest had shown her the way, and now it was time to see it through. And as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true journey was just beginning. Sarah walked deeper into the forest, each step now guided by the pulse of the orb still gripped tightly in her hands. The air had grown colder, and the darkness seemed to deepen around her. But there was a clarity in her heart that hadn't been there before. The weight of the forest's curse still loomed over her, but now she had a purpose. She understood her role even if it terrified her. The visions from the orb had shown her the truth, revealed the shadow that had taken root in the heart of the forest, and now she had to face it. The bear walked at her side, its massive form moving effortlessly through the underbrush, as though it had lived here for centuries. Sarah couldn't help but feel that it wasn't just a guide. It was a protector. The connection she felt to it was deep, instinctive, as though it had been with her all her life, waiting for this moment. She reached the edge of a dense thicket and stopped. In front of her stood the darkened silhouette of an ancient oak tree, its branches twisted into gnarled shapes that seemed to stretch toward the sky like reaching hands. The tree felt different, older, more powerful than anything she had encountered before. It was as if it had been waiting for her, too. The orb began to glow faintly in her hands, its warmth comforting as she held it out in front of her. She could feel the forest's energy pulsing through it, responding to her presence, to the very act of her being here. But as she stared at the oak tree, she felt a sudden, bone-chilling cold seep into her bones. The bear moved closer, its fur brushing against Sarah's leg as it looked up at the tree. The growl that escaped its throat was low, warning, but not aggressive. It was a sound that seemed to reverberate through the ground, resonating with the very earth beneath them. Sarah's mind raced. She knew what this was, the source of the curse, the heart of the darkness that had consumed the forest. This tree was not just a tree. It was a vessel for the ancient evil that had taken root here. But how was she supposed to destroy it? How could she stop something so old, so deeply entrenched in the very fabric of the world around her? With one last glance at the bear, she approached the tree, her heart pounding in her chest. The orb in her hands pulsed in response, growing warmer with each step. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough bark. The moment she touched it, a violent surge of energy shot through her, and she gasped, stumbling backward. The orb in her hands flared bright, its light nearly blinding. The ground beneath her feet shook, and the sky above seemed to ripple, like a storm was brewing, far off in the distance but growing closer. Sarah steadied herself, clutching the orb tighter as the tree before her seemed to shudder, groaning with ancient pain. Its branches creaked, and the air grew thick with tension. A low voice, dark and heavy, seemed to whisper from the very heart of the tree. "You should not have come here," it hissed, its words curling around her like smoke. "You cannot undo what has been done. The forest belongs to me now." Sarah's pulse raced, but she didn't back down. She knew this was the moment, the moment when everything would either fall apart or be restored. She lifted the orb high above her head, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't let you take this land. I won't let you control it any longer." The orb pulsed brighter, and as Sarah held it, she felt a warmth spread through her, filling her body with light. The shadows surrounding her seemed to recoil, as though the very presence of the orb was pushing them back. The dark energy that had held the forest captive began to dissipate, replaced by the raw, pure energy of life. The trees around her groaned, the ground trembled, and Sarah felt an overwhelming force tugging at her very soul. "No!" The voice from the tree raged, its power crackling through the air like lightning. "You are nothing. You cannot defeat me." But Sarah wasn't listening to the voice anymore. She wasn't listening to the fear, to the doubt that tried to worm its way into her mind. She focused on the orb, on the light that now radiated from it, and on the bond she had formed with this forest. The bear at her side growled again, louder this time, as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. The orb's light blazed with a brilliance so bright it seemed to consume the entire clearing. The tree before her writhed, its bark cracking and splintering as though the ancient evil within it was being torn apart. The darkness that had clung to the land for so long began to break apart, unraveling like the threads of a decaying tapestry. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled violently, and for a moment, she feared the earth itself might open up and swallow her whole. But she stood her ground. She held the orb high, feeling its power surge within her, urging her forward. She could feel the forest's energy around her, like 1,000 unseen hands lifting her up, supporting her, guiding her. With a final, deafening roar, the tree cracked open, its massive trunk splitting down the middle, releasing a burst of dark smoke that swirled into the sky. The air was thick with the smell of burning earth, but Sarah held her breath, not allowing herself to be overwhelmed by the chaos. She felt the last remnants of the curse being torn away, the dark energy being cleansed from the very soul of the forest. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The smoke dissipated, and the forest fell silent. Sarah collapsed to her knees, exhausted but victorious. Her body was trembling, and the orb had grown dim once more. But she knew in her heart that the curse was gone. The forest, the land, the balance, it had all been restored. The bear moved to her side, nudging her gently with its massive head. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. The bond between them had been forged through this journey, and now it was complete. The forest had been healed, and the bear had led her to this moment. Sarah reached out, resting a hand on its warm fur, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. The trees around them seemed to sigh with relief, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The air was lighter now, free from the weight of the curse that had held it captive for so long. The forest was alive again, vibrant with new energy, and the dark presence that had once loomed over it was no more. But as Sarah looked up at the bear, a new question formed in her mind. She had done what was needed, but what came next? The forest had been saved, but its mysteries were far from gone. What else did the forest hold? What had she really uncovered? And what would it mean for her life going forward? The bear stepped back, turning toward the path that led deeper into the woods. For a moment, it paused, looking over its shoulder at Sarah, as if silently asking her to follow. Sarah hesitated, her heart still racing, but a sense of peace settled over her. She had been chosen to restore the balance, but her journey wasn't over. The forest had more to offer, more to reveal, and she was ready to listen. With a final glance at the still, broken tree, the remnants of the curse now fading into the earth, Sarah stood up and followed the bear into the depths of the forest. The night seemed less intimidating now, filled with the promise of new beginnings, of untold stories waiting to unfold. And as she walked, she knew that this was only the beginning of her true journey.